and from Jay Sekulow, who testified under oath saying she's the highest-ranking official. Mr. Von
That's
Spakovsky.
all well and good, but you can't refer to her as the lead investigator.
The highest-ranking official in this investigation is Barbara Bosserman, who gave $6,750 to the President of the United States.
No basis in fact.
Reclaiming my
Attorney
time.
General of the
Reclaiming my
United
time.
States has denied it.
Mr. Von Spakovsky, do you agree with the analysis we went through with Mr. Terwilliger and Ms. O'Connor that under the circumstances, Mrs. Bosserman should have been recused from the case?
Yes, and in fact, every lawyer at Justice knows, back to this question of whether the supervisors should be inquiring about their political donations. Look, every lawyer there knows that if you're assigned to a case, you have an absolute professional duty to raise with your supervisor any potential conflicts that could bring this into question. And I would point out that, in fact, prior to what the administration said currently, this administration certainly agrees with this, because a couple of years ago, when evidence came out that a lawyer in the Office of Professional Responsibility at the Justice Department had given almost the same amount of money to the Obama campaign, she was removed by the administration from the IG OPR investigation of the dismissal of the new Black Panther Party case.
Thank you. That was supposed to be 1 minute, but it turned into 5, so I'll have to go to the gentleman from Virginia, and then we'll come to Mr. Meadows. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Van Spakovsky, based on what I just heard you respond to the Chairman, your view is that Ms. Bosserman, as an employee of the Civil Rights Division, should be removed from the case because of her political activity. Is that correct?
She should be removed because her involvement raises in the public a perception about the integrity of the investigation, and that's one of the regulations at the Justice Department.
But the nature of that taint is that she had partisan political activity of some sort. Is that correct?
Specifically, she supported and gave a large number of donations to the administration, which itself is being accused of wrongdoing in this particular matter.
I understand. Now, when you have some expertise in this field because you served as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division from 2002 to 2005, is that correct?
That's correct.
And one of the Deputy Assistant Attorney Generals that you worked with was a man named Bradley Schlotzman, is that correct?
That's correct.
He was a political appointee under the Bush administration, is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you familiar with the Department of Justice's Inspector General report on Mr. Schlotzman?
Oh, certainly I'm aware of it.
And that it concluded he violated Federal law and Department policy by considering political affiliations in hiring decisions and other personnel actions such as the assignment of cases for career attorneys. Are you aware of that finding by the Inspector General?
I'm aware of the findings of that report. I wouldn't characterize them quite the way you have.
Well, let me quote. We concluded, meaning the IG, that Schlotzman inappropriately used political and ideological affiliations in managing the assignment of cases to attorneys in the sections of the division he oversaw. According to sections chiefs Flynn, Cutler, and Palmer, Schlotzman placed limitations on the assignment of cases to attorneys whom he described as libs or pinkos, and he requested that important cases be handled by conservative attorneys he had hired instead. Were you aware of those comments by Mr. Schlotzman?
Not all of them, no, I wasn't.
Any of them?
I read the report.
Based on your sworn testimony here today, I would assume that you would conclude those were inappropriate remarks by Mr. Schlotzman, and based on what you just said to Mr. Jordan, you would have reported them as inappropriate and requiring his recusal from making such decisions because they're so blatantly partisan. Or are you not consistent when it comes to a Republican administration?
No, I'm consistent in saying that lawyers who are assigned to specific cases
Could you answer my question, Mr. Von Spakovsky?
I am answering.
No, sir, you are not.
Did
you or did you not find those comments? Mr. Chairman, I insist on reclaiming my time. I insist on reclaiming my time. We don't have filibusters here in the House, Mr. Von Spakovsky.
He's trying to answer your question.
No, sir.
Ask your question,
he's trying to filibuster my question. Did you or did you not report those comments as inappropriate based on what you just said to Mr. Jordan?
There is nothing in the IG report that says that I did anything wrong. In fact, you can.
I didn't ask that. I didn't ask
you
that. I
can look
asked
through the
if
entire
you
report.
felt-
I was not accused of making any statements of any kind like that. And
Were
I
you
was
asked-
not,
were
I
you
was
asked to be
not
interviewed
accused
by
of
the
knowing
Inspector
about
General?
any statements like
Were you asked to be interviewed by the Inspector General, Mr. Ben Spakowski?
I was, and I
And
told them,
did you agree to it?
I set out and said I would be happy to speak with them if they told me what the questions were and if I was able to review my testimony. They refused to allow that to be done.
So you did not, in fact, allow yourself to be interviewed?
Because they did not afford me the basic due process rights that are given to anyone who's interviewed in a case like
Mr. Schlotzman sent you a number of emails, and one of which I'll quote from. If I recall correctly, a certain voting section attorney is a crazy lib. Hans, meaning you, am I right? A detail would be a great way to get him out of our hair for 6 months. Were you aware of that email to you from Mr. Schlotzman?
I recall the email, yes.
Did you think it was appropriate?
Well, appropriate is very different from whether or not a conflict of interest arises over assignment to a particular case. And that has nothing to do with what we're discussing here today.
Well, I'll decide that, Mr. Ben Spakowski. You're a witness. But
tell me, are you aware of the IG report from last year?
Did Mr. Schlotzman not have a conflict, being a political appointee, in determining the assignment of cases based on someone else's perceived political affiliation? Crazy lib. Is that a professional epithet at the Department of Justice in the Bush administration?
I'm not going to characterize what the IG has said. The report speaks for itself. And if you want another one, you should look at the IG report from March of last year that talked about the harassment and intimidation of conservative employees that has occurred in this administration, including the fact that an employee within the Civil Rights Division lied and committed perjury.
Mr. Chairman, I didn't ask about that, and the witness is answering questions he was not asked. I will ask, however, Mr. Chairman, without objection, that a letter regarding the possible appointment of Mr. Ben Spakowski to the FEC opposing that nomination, signed by the chief of the voting section, the deputy chief of the voting section, the senior trial attorney of the voting section, the senior trial attorney of the voting section, the senior trial attorney of the voting section, and the political geographer of the voting section, dated June 11, 2007, and enumerating the reasons why Mr. Ben Spakowski was not qualified because of his partisan political activities, be entered into the record at this time. I thank the Chair.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask that it be entered into the record the report of the Inspector General from March of last year
We'll get that report and we'll have a committee
about the Civil Rights Division.
We can get that report and have a committee member enter that into the
Mr. Chairman,
record.
I have the July 2008 Inspector General report. Happy to put that in the record as well.
Okay. Without objection. Now turn to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank each of you for your appearance here today and for your testimony. I guess the American people want to trust their government again. And the true problem that we have right now is that many do not trust their government, and specifically do not trust the IRS. And the only avenue to do that is truly to investigate, to make sure that justice prevails and that a thorough investigation happens. I would ask very quickly, each of you, do you not find it surprising that over 40 different individuals that have supposedly been targeted have not been interviewed by an investigative body of this government? Do you not find that surprising?
I guess if we're going to go in order, Mr. Meadows, I mean, I think at least from a distant perspective, yes, it's surprising. I think the public would be more reassured if the government were, and the Justice Department with the FBI, were able to at least say, this is what we're doing generically without being specific about it. That being said, however, and having been on the other side of some of these hearings over the years, the manner in which an investigation, a vigorous investigation, is conducted may be staged in such a way that there are valid reasons not
Sure.
to have known that. But I think what's missing here more than anything, and that your question goes to, is at least some reassurance of the public by disclosure to this committee and elsewhere that in fact a vigorous investigation is being conducted and that there is a strong effort that's appropriate to these, what are really serious allegations, to get to the bottom of it.
Okay, very good. Ms. O'Connor?
I agree. As I said earlier, justice must not only be done, it must also be seen to be done. And it would seem that actually contacting the victims, we know who the victims are, it would seem as though contacting the victims would not tip off anyone's hand about the direction that the investigation is taking and would therefore not harm its integrity.
Okay. On down the line.
I agree, particularly in this case because, look, I coordinated investigations of probably hundreds of cases when I was at the Justice Department, and you talk to the victims first because you want their information, what they can tell you, before you go and you confront the individuals who are accused of wrongdoing, because you use that information to check what they're saying, to cross-examine them. And to not have talked to any of the victims after 9 months, like I said, I just find that incredible.
Okay, Mr. Ivey? I can tell by your response that you have a different take on it. Mr. Ivey, go ahead.
Well, I would at least say I think I need more information along the lines of what Mr. Terwilliger suggested. You want to know what the investigative strategy is. Other things I'd like to know if these individuals have already given other statements, whether it's to this body or to the Inspector General or whoever, because as a prosecutor, if you think...
Yeah, but in your testimony, you were talking about the fact that we shouldn't rush to a conclusion, that sometimes these investigations should take a long time and may very well take a long time, and that we should keep them private. That's what you said in your opening testimony, I believe.
Yes.
So would you say when the President on Super Bowl Sunday made a conclusion to what the investigation outcome already is, do you think that undermines the process?
I would hope not. I would hope that the Attorney General's statement and beyond that...
So the President of the United States making a comment...
the understanding within the Department of Justice...
I didn't mean to interrupt
by
you,
line
I'm sorry.
assistance, that they can go forward with the investigation,
So
ought to still be protected.
So the President of the United States making a definitive statement, there is no corruption, wouldn't influence anybody. Is that
You'd
your
hope
statement?
not. That's correct.
I know we would hope not, but that's your testimony. You believe that it did not.
Well, if that's not the case, and I know there's a call for a special prosecutor, then that wouldn't work either. You're sort of left with a return to the independent counsel era, and I share Mr. Terwilliger's, that'd be a bad idea.
So let me follow up with you, Mr. Ivey, one question in terms of political contributions. Do you think it affects the way that people view other people, political contributions? For example, you donated to the Obama Victory campaign.
I'm pretty sure I did, yeah.
I know you did.
Okay.
You donated to a Democrat that ran against me in North Carolina. And you ran,
okay.
yeah, and you ran.
Sorry.
So do you think it would, affect the way that I would view you?
I hope not.
I would hope not too.
Yeah.
All right, but in that, even if it gave the appearance that my questions were more directed towards you or more definitive because of that, do you not think that would be good to recuse, if you had a prosecutor that just the appearance that it might be a problem, don't you think it would be smart? Your clinical students there at Harvard, don't you tell them, wouldn't it be a good idea if it's just the appearance that you ought to recuse yourself? Now, be careful, because you're going to have lots of students answering your question that may be
I'm
following
sure this will be on the Internet, but I mean the scenario, for example, a U.S. attorney who is of one party in a state where the leadership's dominated by another party. I would never say that that U.S. attorney is incapable of leading an investigation against, whether it's the governor or someone like that.
But this is different. This is the IRS. This is the very foundations of freedom. This is reaching in and actually taking. Do you not think that this requires a higher standard?
Doesn't it sort of depend on the scenario? I mean, the governor of Illinois.
I think it does. That's what I'm saying. Isn't this a higher standard?
The governor of Illinois, who was alleged to be selling Senate seats, I would say, goes to the heart of democracy. And nevertheless, you know, the automatic strategy of the people that represented him was to accuse the U.S. attorneys of
I would conclude that
Political
the IRS reaching in on our liberties and our freedoms goes to the heart of what we're about, and there is no higher calling. I appreciate the patience of the Chair. I yield back.
Would my colleague yield?
Gentleman's recognized briefly.
I just want to confess I may have contributed to your opponent too. I'm sorry.
And I'll forgive you there.
He expected it out of you, but not Mr. Ivey. Let me just pick up real quickly before going to Mr. Desjardins, and we got votes coming, I think, in about 15 minutes. Mr. Ivey, in your testimony, you talked, well, first of all, you talked about the concern about the length. I don't think anyone's concerned, at least I know I've not expressed concern about the length of the investigation. My concern is about the quality. And later in your testimony, you said this: it usually makes more sense to allow the criminal investigation to run its course before public disclosures are made that might undermine or even preclude a criminal prosecution.
Yes.
So I want to go right back to where Mr. Meadows, I mean, the President said there's no corruption. The FBI has leaked to the Wall Street Journal no one's going to be referred for prosecution. So do you think those public disclosures undermine the investigation at the Justice Department of targeting of groups for their political beliefs?
Well, I would honestly say I don't think so. And I think if we want to talk about sort of historical scenarios where a president
Well, tell me what kind of public disclosures are you referencing here then? If the head of the government, who's a potential target of the investigation, says
what's the
no
factual
corruption,
disclosure that the President's statement contains?
It was definitive. It was absolute. It was, there's not a smidgen of corruption. I know, I'm the head of the executive branch. And
as a defense lawyer, what I would be looking for statements from the government, which we seek in every case, is information that I can use to try and figure out what's the scope of the investigation, where is it going, what questions are they asking about my client, which other individuals they're investigating.
Let me see if people have a different opinion than you, Mr. Ivey. Mr. Terwilliger, do you think those public disclosures by the President of the United States and someone at the Justice Department who leaked to the Wall Street Journal that no one was going to be referred for prosecution, do you think those help?
Let me take those separately and address that the President's statement is most unfortunate. I'd really like to believe he didn't intend to have that effect. But even if he didn't intend to have the effect, and even if it doesn't have the effect of changing one iota of how the investigation is conducted, that doesn't mean it doesn't affect public confidence in the investigation and confidence in the government. When the President of the United States, can you imagine if Ronald Reagan, in the middle of Iran-Contra, an investigation going on, had come out publicly and said, well, there's nothing to all this? Of course it's going to shake public confidence, because it's telling the public that this is all a big waste of time. There's nothing really here to look at. In terms of the leak from the FBI, that is particularly devastating, because I think, objectively, and I hope Mr. Cartwright would agree with this, that what we're really looking for here, we the public that is, are really looking for here is confidence that a thorough investigation, a law enforcement investigation, will be conducted. And when you have the principal law enforcement agency in the United States, if in fact that is the real view, saying, well, nothing's going to result from this before the investigation is completed, that shakes public confidence in the integrity of that process.
Ms. O'Connor and Mr. Painter, and Mr. von Spakovsky, would you agree with Mr. Ivey's statement? It makes more sense to allow criminal investigations to run their course before public disclosures are made that might undermine the prosecution. Do you think that would you agree with Mr. Ivey's statement, and that what took place here is a direct contradiction to his statement?
Investigations do need to be permitted to run their course with the appropriate confidentiality so that they can be run with integrity. I'd like to address your point about the President's statement, if I might. The President's statements carry a lot of weight. They do a lot of good or a lot of harm. Markets can rise and fall on the statement by the President. And not only did this President say that there was not a smidgen of corruption, but back in 2010, he started bashing conservative groups and suggesting that they were shadowy and had questionable contributions, and the Internal Revenue Service started opening unprecedented audits of donors to contribute to conservative groups. So certainly the statements of a president have a tremendous impact on the people who work for the federal government.
Thank you. I've got to go quickly, Mr. Bonspell and Mr. Painter. if you could.
Of course, a criminal investigation should be allowed to run its course, but that does not prevent the Justice Department from providing general information on the status of the investigation to you because of your oversight functions. Also, look, the President's the chief law enforcement officer. Everybody else reports to him, and it is completely inappropriate for him to be telling the people working for him, here's what your conclusion should be in your investigation.
We got the worst of everything here. We couldn't get the basics from the Justice Department. Who's heading the investigation? How many agents? Have you talked to any of the victims? We couldn't get the basics, but we get definitive public disclosures from the President of the United States and leaks to the Wall Street Journal saying, no harm, no foul here, no one's going to be prosecuted, not a smidgen of corruption. So we got the worst of everything. We couldn't get the basics that when you all worked at Justice, you gave all the time, but we get definitive statements saying no one's going to be prosecuted, nothing's wrong here. So it was exactly backwards what we got from this Justice Department. And with that, I went over time, so I have to yield to the gentleman from Tennessee. I apologize. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
No problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for being here today. The title of today's hearing is the Obama administration conducting a serious investigation of IRS targeting. Based on the testimony, what we've heard here today, let me just go down the line and say just yes or no. Do you feel like there's a serious investigation going on?
Honestly, sir, I can't tell. And the fact that I can't tell is exactly the problem, because the public needs to understand that, in fact, a serious investigation is going on.
Okay. Ms. O'Connor?
That's exactly right. I have no basis on which to form an opinion, and the public does deserve to know that there is a serious investigation underway if there is.
Okay. Is everyone's opinion the same? We really can't tell?
Yeah, we really can't tell, and that in itself is a real problem.
Okay. Ms. O'Connor, do you think that there was any reason that this targeting took place other than to affect a political outcome?
Well, I certainly can't speak to the motivations, but that was the result.
Okay. Do you think that rogue agents within an agency like the IRS would be capable of independently constructing a targeting scheme of this magnitude without direction from higher up?
That's highly unlikely. Okay.
So, the President was very upset when he learned of this. Well, everybody was. Both sides of the aisle were extremely upset, but now as time has passed, it's turned into, more of a joke. Either that or this side of the aisle in this committee is the only one that doesn't have as much information as the President and everyone else, because they seem to have already concluded that there's not going to be any criminal charges, that there's not a smidgen of corruption, but yet a political election could have been impacted, and probably was, by the actions of these agents in the IRS. So, in your opinion, there had to be somebody giving direction, and therefore this is something that should be investigated seriously.
We've seen the consequences of the misconduct. We know that it happened. Yeah. What needs to be found out is how and why did it happen. Okay.
Is there any, really, can anyone sit there and think there's any other reason that it happened other than to prevent people from expressing their political opinions?
I don't think we know. We are entitled, the American people are entitled to answers to this, but we just don't know.
But yet we're getting the attitude now that there's nothing to see here, we need to move on. I think there was a president a few years ago that claimed he was not a crook, and we all know how that turned out. Mr. Ivey, I agree that an investigation should be thorough, but would you be the first one in line to say this president should be impeached if he was involved in this?
I have no reason to think that impeachment should be even part of the conversation with respect to this issue.
But this president is confident that there was not a smidgen of corruption, yet he was outraged when this broke, and now all of a sudden he seems to have answers that we don't have. Well, so going back to President Nixon, who was not a crook, if President Obama knows what was going on here, should he be impeached?
I wouldn't think that impeachment's really a viable part of the discussion on this at this point. I did want to say quickly, though, with respect to President Reagan, I do recall him making a statement with respect to Iran-Contra that he wasn't aware of any wrong. I believe it was a statement from the Oval Office, because I remember watching it. And as we know, the investigation took its course. I think that's what's going to happen here, too.
Okay, well, we hope that we get answers because that's why we're here today. We're trying to have a serious investigation, but yet for some reason we can't seem to get answers. We can't get Lois Lerner back here. Hopefully that'll change because there's certainly something that was going on. The IRS admitted that they wrongfully targeted these groups, and we know that these groups were probably going to be in opposition to this president, and we know that it went to a political appointee from the White House. So we've learned all these things through the process of the investigation, but yet we're sitting here today with basically Attorney General and anonymous sources saying that there's not going to be any criminal charges. So it's hard to think that there's a serious investigation going on when this is the kind of runaround that we're getting here. It's getting to look like somebody really wants us to move on from this. It's not much unlike Benghazi. It seems to be there's a pattern going on here. So at any rate, you know, we're going to continue to push. We're going to continue to look for answers, and you know, this is not going to go away. So,
if I may,
yes,
before you yield your time, sir, respond to Mr. Ivey's comment about President Reagan. If President Obama had come out and said, I was out of the loop, I didn't know what happened in any of this IRS business, that would be perfectly fine. He has a political base to cover and so forth. And that's what my recollection, as with Mr. Ivey's, is basically what President Reagan said. But that's not what President Obama said. What President Obama said was a definitive statement that there was no corruption, not his personal involvement, but everybody else. And what kind of message does that send to the American people about a commitment to the kind of investigation that we all seem to agree is needed?
I appreciate that observation. Thanks to all the witnesses. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Terwilliger, you're recommending the President say, I was out of the loop. Is that what you're recommending?
Well, if he was going to say anything at all, all I'm saying is that that kind of statement would not be inappropriate. The statement that he did make is ill-advised at best.
Thank you, sir. Ms. O'Connor, you are now in the private sector, I take it?
Yes, I am.
And you're with a private firm providing tax advice and assistance?
I wouldn't exactly call it tax advice, but yes,
tax law advice.
I am in private practice.
Very good. Do you represent any progressive or liberal groups that were applying for C4 status?
I do not, nor conservative.
Well, the reason I ask you that is we were here, I'm sorry Dr. Desjardins has left, but we were here on this committee when the Inspector General of the Treasury came, Mr. Russell George, and he had authored something like a 28-page report which blew the lid off of the BOLOs, the be on the lookout for Tea Party and conservative groups, Liberty, groups with conservative-sounding names. And the whole report detailed the discussion of the conservative groups, and there was a footnote that said, and some other groups were involved as well. But he never mentioned that progressive or liberal groups were also on the be on the lookout lists, that the searches included progressive and liberal groups, in other words, the opposite end of the political spectrum. He never revealed that to us, so we were here in this full committee in a high state of outrage. In fact, Ranking Member Cummings went through the roof when Russell George was first here testifying to that report. And I was outraged myself personally because it is fundamentally un-American, the kinds of things he was talking about, to say that one particular type of political group would be targeted by civil servants in the IRS. And it was only after that we found out that both ends of the political spectrum were targeted, and that's why I asked you that question, Ms. O'Connor. Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman.
Might I comment?
Sure.
You said that Mr. George hid from you the fact that some progressive-sounding groups had also been targeted, but you did have the report, and it was in the report. I might add that the number of conservative groups caught in that filter versus the number of progressive groups was something like 100 to 2.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because when we start talking statistics and bandying about numbers, one of the things you wonder is, well, as a percentage, how many of the progressive groups got targeted? how many of the conservative groups, is it a fact that there are just way more conservative groups who are applying for C4 status? I think that's an appropriate inquiry at some time we ought to engage in. Thank you, Ms. O'Connor.
Happy to.
Mr. von Spakovsky, just, this is a little bit tangential, but you have time at the FEC?
Yes.
Is that correct?
2 years.
Okay. And I'm curious because there's this issue that's come up recently where maybe the most vicious of the President's critics in terms of books and movies, Dinesh D'Souza, was indicted for potentially illicit campaign contributions. And what caught my eye, and actually some members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Republicans, have written to ask about what the process is, because it just seemed weird that that would just be a routine review to see that there were $20,000 that I guess the allegation is he reimbursed those. So how did it go? How would these reviews take place at the FEC? And would the FBI come in and do routine reviews? Can you just give us a brief snapshot on how you understood the process when you were there?
Well, I don't recall the FBI coming in for routine reviews when I was there. The odd thing about that statement is what the accusation against Dinesh D'Souza is a conduit contribution. In other words, that he reimbursed other individuals for contributions they made. A routine review of donation records would not turn that up.
Exactly.
Because the donations that he supposedly reimbursed folks for would have been made by other individuals in their names. So just reviewing the record isn't going to show that. The only way you can discover that is if you get some kind of information, or witness or somebody who calls you and says, I know that this person was reimbursing these contributions. So a routine review would not reveal that.
Great. And so do you think that that it is worth writing, as these senators did, to ask about what the typical review consists of, and given that was the explanation that we've gotten, which is not really sufficient?
I think that's fully within the oversight responsibilities of Congress.
Very good. And then, Ms. O'Connor, my final, I mean, you mentioned the auditing of donors, how that is kind of, and I just, anecdotally, I've had people come up to me and just say, I've been in business 20, 30 years, started writing checks for Romney, and now I've gotten audit. Now, that's just, correlation does not equal causation, but I've heard it enough to where it's something that, so can you speak to that? Is that something that you've dealt with in your practice?
It's not something that I've personally dealt with in my practice, but I was aware of the fact, because I was getting calls about it, that whereas the Internal Revenue Service had never before audited contributors to 501c4s for gift tax obligations, they began doing that in, I think it was 2010. And again, it was after the President had made public statements in his weekly radio address, in speeches, bashing contributors to conservative organizations, challenging that they were shadowy, that they were questionable, just making, encouraging the IRS, whose obligation it is to look into these things, to look into these things. And so it was unprecedented. There were letters from Congress to the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue saying, why are you all of a sudden looking at the gift tax obligations arising from contributions to 501c4s? Steve Miller, as Deputy Commissioner at the time, wisely told everybody at the IRS to stand down on this issue, that before the IRS started enforcing laws in this fashion, it was going to have some notice and public comment. So this, again, is an outgrowth of public statements letting the Internal Revenue Service know what they ought to be doing.
Well, thank you for that, and I thank the witnesses for your time and your thoughtful testimony. I thank the ranking member for your participation, and I would just say I think we can disagree about even amongst Republicans, Democrats. The public can have different views on some of this stuff, but I think it's true that at this point, there is at least an appearance that this investigation is not going the way that we would hope an investigation would go. And given the sensitivities involved, I think that we really do need to move in a different direction. And I would just agree with the witnesses who've said the Attorney General can appoint a special prosecutor. And let's just get to the bottom of this, because ultimately, whatever accountability is there, there's got to be a sense amongst the public that that they have some confidence in what happened, given this situation. And so I thank the chairman who's had to leave for holding this committee. And right now we have votes, so I'll excuse all the witnesses. Thanks again, and we are adjourned.